Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 23 of Truth is Justice. Dear Mr. Devlin, my name is Sam Carroll. I've taken an interest in the Sandra Jean Melgar case and, along with a small team, have been reviewing the case materials for the last several months. With respect to the forensic examination, it is my understanding that your position, which others are stating was confirmed by you to them as recently as January 2019, is that the login and password entries, page 58 of the examination, with respect to the Gateway laptop, specifically the last login and last incorrect password entries, represented underlying system-generated events, and that those events were not, in your opinion, indicative of a user interacting with the system at that time. I've approached numerous digital forensic specialists, and it has been their unanimous view that logged events of that type and under those circumstances would be indicative of user activity and not system-generated events. In the coming days, I will be publishing a podcast episode with these views offered by multiple specialists in the field of digital forensics. Prior to doing so, I just wanted to seek confirmation from you that your position is as stated above with respect to your classification of the entries. If that is not your position, can you please describe what your position is with respect to those entries? Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Devlin, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Kind regards, Sam Carroll. The work was completed under attorney-client privilege, so I cannot discuss the particulars of the case. What I can say is that the recovered information was detailed in my report, and I stand by my findings. As for the information you have on my position regarding these activities, that is incorrect. My opinion is that a last login and an incorrect password is absolutely indicative of a user-based activity. For this type of information to be found in the system logs requires an outside input. The system on a Windows computer will not generate an entry of a login or a password attempt without an outside user, intentionally and unintentionally manipulating the keyboard or mouse. However, I also believe that if you look at the simple login, logout logs, you miss a considerable amount of information. You need look at the user activity within the other system and registry files to see if the computer was being actively and continuously manipulated or whether it was powered, signed into, and just left to sit. You want to look for user-generated activity such as website logins, programs initiated, searches conducted, for a better indication of human activity. Eric Devlin, Director, Lone Star Forensic Group. What you just heard is the email I sent to Mr. Eric Devlin on Wednesday the 6th of March 2019 and his reply just over an hour later. Mr. Max Seacrest, in talking with Bob on his Sunday episode, noted that he was addressing the rumours surrounding Mr. Devlin speaking to someone about the computer logins. For those that didn't already know, I don't think I'm wrong when I say the someone referred to is me, and the question of whether it is rumours, well, the fact that communications happened are definitely not rumours. They are fact, as you just heard. I'll leave it up to you to decide what the implications for the testimony are. My view, as I will expand on during this episode, is that in response to one question in particular during trial, I simply don't see how Mr. Devlin's position can be that he stands by it. What was highlighted by Adam many months ago now is just as important as when he first raised it. I thought the way Mr. Seacrest approached the question from Bob was interesting. He started his discussion of the topic by noting that it was clear and easy. So clear and easy, in fact, that he took 2.5 minutes to try and explain it and was able to successfully do so without even actually addressing the underlying question or mentioning the logins or addressing the question as to whether anyone was interacting with the computer at the time. Quite remarkable, really, especially for a topic that is clear and easy. Almost like when a politician is asked a straightforward yes or no question and manages to entirely avoid providing an answer. Mr. Seacrest did state that Mr. Devlin stands by his trial testimony. That's a very different statement to Mr. Devlin standing behind his findings in the report. Standing by his trial testimony, with his response to one question in particular, seems to be entirely at odds with the findings in his report, with respect to the logins, and entirely at odds with his own interpretation of his report. But more on that in a little while. There is an important reason why I believe Mr. Seacrest wouldn't specifically address that question about the logins, because it is highly problematic for Sandra's defence. Whilst Bob has offered up a wildly far-fetched scenario that he believes is plausible, the reality is that it would be almost impossible to convince a jury that Sandra is innocent whilst accepting the fact that those logins required someone to be interacting with the laptop. I'll get into the details of that in a few minutes, but for now, let's go back and break down Mr. Devlin's email and let me try and explain the whole computer login issues as simply as possible. For those that struggle to understand IT issues, this matter is actually not that complicated, despite Bob trying to make it seem that way. In my email to him, I asked Mr. Devlin one very important question. Was it his position that the failed login attempt and the successful login on the Sandy user on the Gateway laptop was created by anything other than a human interacting with the computer at that time? Mr. Devlin's response was crystal clear. He noted that that was not his position. And to quote from him, "My opinion is that a last login and an incorrect password is absolutely indicative of a user-based activity." And the word absolutely was put in all capitals. And before I move on to the next part, I'll stress the importance of that comment from Mr. Devlin. And that comment is consistent with every forensic IT specialist I've spoken with about this matter. Every single one. The nature of those logins is absolutely consistent with someone physically interacting with the laptop to cause those logins. The circumstances where it took place, a suburban home, a user account on a laptop in a middle-class area with no indication that Jim or Sandra were hiding state secrets, and no similarly timed logins or login attempts on the other laptop or the desktop, and no IT specialist worth his salt would offer up an even remotely reasonable alternative other than a person physically interacting with the laptop at that time. And that is exactly what Mr. Devlin goes on to say, and to quote him again, carrying on immediately from the quote I just provided. "For this type of information to be found in the system logs requires an outside input. The system on a Windows computer will not generate an entry of a login or a password attempt without an outside user, intentionally and unintentionally manipulating the keyboard or mouse." So stopping here again for a moment. For anyone to question Mr. Devlin's categorization of the failed password attempt and the successful login is to, at the same time, question his competency. And I am definitely not doing that. Any argument that the failed password attempt and the successful login is anything other than an event triggered by a human interacting with the computer at that time is also an argument against the skills of Mr. Devlin in identifying the nature of those system events. If you offer that argument up, then it would follow that you would have to throw out, or at least question the integrity of every single finding that Mr. Devlin had made. And that is where there is a big problem for the defence. Either they say that Mr. Devlin is right about his characterisation of the logins in his email to me, which has massive implications for Sandra's narrative, or they say he was wrong about the characterisation of the logins in his email to me, which then necessarily raises doubts about the integrity of his entire report. But Mr. Seacrest managed to walk that fine line of not commenting on either, while still providing a 2.5-minute answer. So far, we have Mr. Devlin confirming that a failed password attempt and a successful login on a Windows-based laptop would require someone to be physically interacting with the computer at that time. In other words, at 11:02 p.m, someone was touching the laptop keyboard or mouse, and again at 11:39 p.m, someone was touching the laptop keyboard or mouse. we cannot necessarily make any assumptions about what did or did not happen between those two times, because they are the last events of that type noted in the report. Someone may have logged on successfully immediately after the failed password attempt, and then logged on successfully again 37 minutes later. We don't know. Mr. Devlin then goes on to talk about what other information is useful in determining whether the computer was being actively and continuously manipulated, or whether it was powered, signed into, and just left to sit. To quote Mr. Devlin, and carrying on from above again. However, I also believe that if you look at the simple login, logout logs, you miss a considerable amount of information. You need to look at the user activity within the other system and registry files to see if the computer was being actively and continuously manipulated, or whether it was powered, signed into, and just left to sit. Mr. Devlin is again making it crystal clear what his point is. Someone definitely had to physically log onto the machine, or in the case of the failed password attempt, physically interact with the machine through either the keyboard or the mouse. But he notes that you need to look at further system entries and events to see whether they then did anything with the laptop once they were logged in. Mr. Devlin is not, I repeat, is not questioning whether someone physically interacted with the machine at those times. His stance in that respect is entirely maintained. Mr. Devlin then finishes the email with a final sentence. To quote him again, "You want to look for user-generated activity, such as website logins, programs initiated, searches conducted, for a better indication of human activity." It is this final sentence that I think is the most helpful in explaining Mr. Devlin's trial testimony. What Mr. Devlin is saying here is that the way you determine whether someone is continually interacting with a machine, beyond just manipulating the keyboard or mouse, is to look at what activities they performed. Did they open up any specific programs or perform any website searches? And Mr. Devlin is not backing away from the assertion that someone had to interact with the laptop at the point where the failed password attempt and the successful login entries were recorded. He is simply noting what needs to be analysed to work out what they did once they had logged in. So to be absolutely crystal clear here again, there is no dispute whatsoever based on this email correspondence about whether someone had to physically manipulate the keyboard and or the mouse at the times of those entries. None. Mr. Devlin made that absolutely clear, and like I've said, no credible IT professional would make a different determination to that which he made. Mr. Devlin noted in the email that he stands by the findings in his report, and Mr. Seacrest confirmed the same thing, and that is a very important point to make. Critical, really, for us to understand what those logins mean. If Mr. Devlin had made the comment that he believed there were errors in the report, or that he stood by parts of it and not others, then this would all have the potential to be a storm in a teacup. But he didn't. He stands by the analysis he undertook and the findings that he presented, and that is what makes these events so incredibly interesting, and, in my view, significantly damaging to Sandra's defence and her often stated narrative. I've suggested in earlier episodes that the fact that these logins happened at around the time when the murder took place could be spun in a particular way by the defence that may have some level of plausibility. And whilst I still believe that would be done, I no longer think the story to come from how it is spun would be plausible or believable. I think the reaction by the defence to this whole matter somewhat confirms that. They are aware of the implications. Now, to look at Mr. Devlin's trial testimony, and this is where it gets a little more interesting, and not because his views on the nature of the logins changes necessarily. I don't believe he does that in any way in his response to most of the questions, but because it is where the power of language becomes so important, especially legally, and especially where he answers questions from Mr. Seacrest. His position becomes somewhat more murky when he responds to Ms. Barnett. And one point to make when you consider these interactions and the way Mr. Devlin responds is that Mr. Devlin hasn't always been an IT specialist. He graduated from law school in 2001, is licensed as an attorney by the State Bar of Texas, and worked as a prosecutor in Harris County until 2012. So first, his interactions on direct examination with Mr. Seacrest in relation to the logins. Mr. Seacrest asks Mr. Devlin, "Let's start with that, as far as use of the various computers. What did your analysis show in that regard?" And then Mr. Devlin responds, "I found 3 devices. Neither device had any significant activity, any significant user activity between the hours of about 7:40 p.m. on December 22nd and December 23rd around 4 p.m. There were occasional activity within that period, but they're called Windows prefetched files, other Windows log files. If you were sitting at your computer and operating it and manipulating it and going to different types of websites or email, all of that stuff is tracked. If you are not sitting at the computer, that doesn't mean that the computer is just sitting there not doing anything. Modern computers are all the time communicating with itself, making sure that certain things are running correctly, and it logs everything. So you see a lot of files that are constantly being used that are not evidence of actual user activity. Mr. Seacrest responds with a follow-up question. So bottom line, based upon your experience, were you convinced that those devices were not in use by a human being during the hours you just mentioned? And then Mr. Devlin responds, correct. Mr. Devlin's first sentence is very interesting. Neither device had any significant activity, any significant user activity between the hours of about 7:40 p.m. on December 22nd and December 23rd at around 4 p.m. I've spoken before about Mr. Devlin's decision to use the word neither, so I won't go over that again, but what I will draw your attention to is his carefully selected description of the user activity. He isn't saying that there absolutely wasn't any user activity. He is saying that there wasn't any significant user activity. Now, what's significant user activity? Well, I think you can go back to the email he sent for an answer to that question. It seems very clear that Mr. Devlin was not including the process of logging into a machine and walking away as representing significant user activity. The second question from Mr. Seacrest pushes that a little further and asks whether any of the devices were in use by a human during the same hours. And Mr. Devlin's response of correct is still not necessarily going against his position with respect to the logins. Mr. Devlin's position seems to be clear. Someone logging into a laptop and then doing nothing else wouldn't represent significant activity in his opinion. So to say that the devices were not in use by a human during that time depends on the way you are thinking about the question. If you don't consider a login to be in the category of using the computer, then it fits perfectly well, and it seems to be what Mr. Devlin meant. But the clarity of his responses changes significantly when it comes to responding to Ms. Barnett, and it is this interaction that should leave you scratching your head. And Ms. Barnett asked the question of Mr. Devlin, as to this time frame of December 22nd from 7:40 p.m. to December 23rd 4 p.m, you said there was no computer usage, right? Mr. Devlin responds, there was no user usage. And then Ms. Barnett asks, what is that? And Mr. Devlin responds, there was computer activity, but they were Windows log files, activity that the computer will normally log and create without any user input. And Ms. Barnett responds, and I'm not really interested in that. I think you're testifying that no one logged on or off the computer during that time. Is that right? And Mr. Devlin replies, correct. That last part of the interaction is where I think Mr. Devlin moved beyond the skillful use of semantics and gave an answer that is very difficult to explain, whilst at the same time holding on to the thought that he was being entirely truthful or understanding the question that was asked of him. Ms. Barnett's question, whether anyone logged on or off the computer, was about as to the point as you can get. This is not a question asking about user activity or significant user activity. It was straightforward, and Mr. Devlin's response was equally clear. The question was, did anyone log on or log off the machine during those times? So how can that be? To be entirely honest with you, I simply don't know an innocent way to explain it. An innocent way to explain how Mr. Devlin could have responded in that way. All of the responses, except that one, can be explained based on his position now and based on the way he very carefully responded to each of them. How can the logins be simultaneously absolutely requiring someone to interact with the computer in some way, either the keyboard or the mouse, but also giving that answer to Ms. Barnett? I have no idea at all. To hold that answer as valid, that no one logged on or off the machine during those times, is to question his finding in his own report. And going back to what I said earlier, not only does it contradict his own analysis and his own report and his position as stated in the email to me, if true, it raises questions of the validity of every finding in his report. It's worth noting that despite all of the effort by Bob, all of his followers, Liz, Mr. Seacrest and Ms. Seacrest, effort all pretty much completely focused on challenging me and disputing my comments, they haven't done the one very simple thing that would bring it all to an end. Explain this seeming conflict between the report, the views shared by Mr. Devlin, his responses at trial to Mr. Sechrest, and the one unusual response to Ms. Barnett's question, specifically about the logins. And why wouldn't they do that? Well, in reality, this will most likely only come up again if Sandra finds herself back facing another trial. So it serves almost no purpose for the defence to get to the bottom of it. In fact, it can only do harm. Leave it all alone so that there is no risk of damaging some of the public sentiment surrounding Sandra. Because as I said at the beginning, in my opinion, these logins represent such a significant problem for the defence that trying to build a narrative around someone interacting with the laptop at about the time Jim was murdered is incredibly difficult. But how does that explain Bob's disinterest in getting to the bottom of particular things? Well, I think you all probably know the answer to that. Whilst Bob notes now that it isn't a Free Sandy show, if it was a Justice for Jim show, then a matter like this that gives insight into the time around Jim's murder would deserve much more than a statement that Bob simply doesn't know much about computers. The real question here, the real question that people should be asking, including Bob, is why the discrepancy between Mr. Devlin's report, his trial testimony, his comments to Mr. Sechrest, and his email to me. Forget about disputing whether they actually happened. Address the actual question of how a witness can provide such conflicting answers to a very simple question. And one of the really fascinating observations I've made with respect to the way this whole matter has been handled is the expectation by many, including Bob and his followers, that the defence will tell the complete truth. I say fascinating because if you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense to believe that the defence would be completely honest and upfront about everything to do with their client's case. Now, I'm in no way simplifying it, but Sandra's defence team essentially have one job: to represent her in a way that achieves the best possible outcome for her at each stage of the legal process. They have no obligation to tell the whole story or to tell the complete truth. They can be very political in their approach and spin the story however they want in a way that benefits their client. In fact, that is what you want them to do. It is what they have to do for their client. Now, I'm not talking about straight out lying, but as many people know, those who are good with words can manage to not lie about something while still not being entirely upfront. Now, Bob frames the story in this way. We have the dishonest and corrupt prosecution and law enforcement and pretty much everyone to do with an individual's prosecution. Then on the other side, he paints the picture of the entirely honest, believable and entirely respectable defence team, and the same qualities attached to all of those individuals connected with the defence. Mr. Sechrest said it best himself when he noted that it doesn't matter to him whether his client is innocent or guilty. He has one job, and he does that job irrespective of their guilt. The quite amazing thing about the way Bob presents it is that it works for his audience. Prosecution and professionals connected with the state are bad, and defence counsel and their witnesses are good. Quite remarkable, but it does say a lot about what some of his audience firmly believe, irrespective of the case he covers, and that is why the narrative immediately pins the bad label on the prosecution and all of those connected to it. It sets the framework for his coverage of the case, regardless of whether it is all a lie. Now, I also wanted to briefly address something else that came up during Bob's talk with Mr. Sechrest. You'll notice, and not for the first time, that Bob cannot see the relevance of the questions Ms. Barnett asks of Mr. Devlin, specifically those questions relating to knots. Now, Bob and Mr. Sechrest have a bit of a back and forth here about how Ms. Barnett did that so often, apparently. Brought up questions with an expert that didn't specifically fall into the sphere of their expertise. But that isn't the whole story with respect to Mr. Devlin, not even close. You see, if you look at the beginning of the testimony from Mr. Devlin, Ms. Barnett's questions make a lot more sense. Far from being pointless, they were actually entirely understandable. So here's an interaction that took place just before Ms. Barnett's cross-examination of Mr. Devlin. This was the second last question that Mr. Sechrest asked of Mr. Devlin. Now, to quote Mr. Sechrest, "What specific terms did you apply in this case that you thought would be useful in conducting a transparent review of the computers?" And Mr. Devlin's response was, "I received information that some sort of knot tying was important. I'm a Boy Scout, so I was pretty good at knot tying and everything else. I'm also a sailor with my father-in-law, but I don't know all the names for knots. But I did do a very extensive search for any type of knot tying websites, that type of thing. So, do you get an understanding now of why Ms. Barnett may have been interested in asking Mr. Devlin several questions about knots? Because literally 2 questions earlier, he had spoken about his knowledge of knots, bringing it up himself, along with his knowledge of sailing. He's claimed to be pretty good at knot tying and everything else, so of course you would seek to challenge that, perhaps even more so now, given what we know about the computer logins and the apparent contradictions in his statements. So whether Bob simply didn't read Mr. Devlin's testimony, or whether he did and chose to disregard it, the conclusion is the same. He's not interested in understanding the reason for things. He is just interested in painting a particular picture. In this instance, that Ms. Barnett's line of questioning was irrational. The fact that Mr. Seacrest jumps on that same bandwagon in this talk with Bob is interesting, and I think gives you some insight into the role of defence counsel and the lengths they are prepared to go to win public support. In the end, at this point, and in my opinion, it is that public support that is one of the most important aspects of Sandra's defence. Another interesting point to come from Bob's interaction with Mr. Seacrest was the information given that Mr. Billy Belk had been provided with all of the case materials, every bit of it from the defence team. And of course he would be. So why is that interesting? Well, we heard week after week about how Bob was waiting on the material from the DA's office. It even became a point on which Bob sought to challenge us here at Truth is Justice with his erroneous claims of preferential treatment or something similar. It became a point on which Bob could further hammer home the idea of the prosecution being in some way corrupt and delaying his receipt of the case material. Now, one question quite a few people have asked, and it's a very legitimate question, why didn't Bob simply obtain the case materials from Mr. Seacrest's office? All of the mentions of how he was waiting and waiting for the case material and couldn't get it when it was sitting with Sandra's counsel the whole time, and presumably readily accessible. If Sandra was supportive of Bob's efforts from the beginning, then surely it would have been a simple matter of approving the release of the material to Bob. Or perhaps there's more to it. Who knows? Now, last week, I mentioned that I was going to raise a few points that might cause you to stop and think about the validity of the intruder scenario. And the first of those is the amended forensic report. We've heard a lot from Bob and his followers about how different things in the house should have been tested. But what many of his listeners have heard very little about is exactly what was tested, what was swabbed, etc., and the results. And there's very good reason for that, because some of it is quite difficult to explain, at least from a defence perspective. And thank you to Debbie for putting a post up on our Facebook page and generating discussion on the findings of this report. On the 24th of May 2016, a Notice of Amendments was issued by the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences. The Notice of Amendments notes that all previously reported statistics from the previously issued reports were updated based on the 2015 FBI amended population database, and interpretations for selected items were updated based on standard operating procedures. Whilst this report is on our website, I will upload a copy to the page dedicated to this episode. Just go to podcast and click on episode 23 to be taken to the page. Amongst other things, the report highlights what items within the Melgar home were swabbed for forensic testing, and the results of those swabs. Some of you will be familiar with some of these results, and some of them will probably come as a surprise. First, the jacuzzi swabs. This is swabs taken from the jacuzzi that Sandra claims her and Jim were in on the night he was murdered. The results obtained were consistent with a single source DNA profile of a female individual. Sandra could not be excluded as the possible source of the DNA from the jacuzzi. Now, what's interesting here is the absence of Jim's DNA, or anyone else's DNA for that matter, especially given that it has been offered up as a location where the supposed intruders dumped their clothing and cleaned themselves up. And given that Sandra claims her and Jim spent up to 2 hours in the jacuzzi, including getting in and out and having sex, the absence of Jim's DNA on the swabs taken from the jacuzzi is truly puzzling, especially if you accept Sandra's narrative. And we can move on to some other items. The dresser drawer swabs, no DNA results obtained. The upright cabinet knob swabs, no DNA results obtained. The corner bedroom doorknob swabs, the open kitchen cabinet swabs, the interior utility doorknob swabs, the back doorknob swabs, the pistol grip swabs, no DNA results obtained on any of those. If you find that interesting, then you are not alone. In that list are so many items that would be touched on a regular basis, and in the case of the gun, would presumably be handled carefully, so not just very quickly grabbed and dropped. Yet, those items provide no DNA results. The grip of a gun in particular is interesting, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Now, I'm not a DNA expert. I have what I believe is a reasonably strong general science knowledge, and I'm not going to tell you that I'm a DNA expert in training or that I have multiple books on DNA on my bookshelf or anything like that. Doing that whilst at the same time criticising and challenging those who are academically qualified and significantly experienced seems more than a little hypocritical. What I am going to do is tell you a little bit about DNA, not from my direct knowledge, but from scientific papers. Now, these are general concepts. I'm not going to go into any specific detail, but this information will hopefully help you understand the DNA results a little better. All of the references will be included in the show notes and on the episode 23 page on the website if you want to follow them up. In a 2010 article by Daly, Murphy and McDermott titled "The Transfer of Touch DNA from Hands to Glass, Fabric and Wood," the authors provide details on the concentration of DNA obtained from coming into contact with various items. One interesting point they make is that the amount of DNA transferred to an object during handling was found to be entirely independent of the handling time. Meaning, if you touch an object and immediately remove your hand, the DNA you have potentially transferred to that object would be no different than if you touched the object and left your hand there for 60 seconds. Things that do impact on the amount of DNA include the person who handled the object and the nature of the object itself, e.g. the material, whether it was, say, wood or glass. An interesting side note here. Normally skin and other cells that are sufficiently damaged die through a process known as apoptosis and are shed from the body. According to information found on the Lupus Foundation of America website and some other similar websites and papers, individuals suffering from lupus can have an increased rate of apoptosis, meaning the skin cells are dying more frequently and being shed more frequently. And back to the article. The study used 3 different samples: glass vials, a 7cm by 7cm cut piece of cotton fabric, and an 8.5cm by 1.7cm by 3cm cut out from a piece of decorative corner timber. Now, it's quite an interesting study. The way they did it was to place the objects in sealed bags, and they were sterilised via autoclaving and irradiated to ensure no DNA samples were present. And a volunteer would open the bag, hold the object for 60 seconds, and place the object back in the bag and seal it, only noting on the bag whether they were male or female. As the title indicated, the study was interested in the transfer of touch DNA to each of those objects. And why am I talking about all this? Well, to explain that an item that is swabbed and reveals no DNA can be significant, especially if that item is something that is regularly interacted with. The range of estimated total DNA amounts obtained from the 3 objects was 0 to 5.2 nanograms for the glass vial, with a mean of 0.52 nanograms, 0 to 14.8 nanograms for the fabric, with a mean of 1.23 nanograms, and 0 to 169 nanograms for the piece of wood, with a mean of 5.85 nanograms. To put this in perspective, as of 2005, so nearly 15 years ago, but I understand it's still the same now, full DNA profiles require concentrations of between 0.5 nanograms to 1 nanogram. Of the 100 glass vials, a sample of 40 was taken to obtain DNA profiles. 19 of those showed no alleles present, basically meaning not even a partial profile could be obtained. A discussion on alleles, genes, and chromosomes is way beyond this discussion, but by all means look it up if you're interested. Of the 100 pieces of fabric, a sample of 24 were taken to conduct DNA analysis, and all 24 had at least 1 allele present. Of the 100 pieces of wood, 59 were taken to obtain DNA profiles, and all but 7 had at least 1 allele present. So what does all of that mean? It means, in my layperson interpretation, that it is more likely than not that some DNA will be transferred when an object is touched, and that a finding of no DNA present can be significant, especially on something commonly touched. Whilst the study does address the impact on touch DNA transferred based on the length of time, it doesn't address the consequences of repeated touching or what can lead to a greater concentration of DNA being found on a given object. For that, we can look at some other research papers, and they indicate that the amount of skin cells shed by an individual can be relevant. And the reference for that is from 2002 paper by Lowe et al. And again, rather than giving the full reference here, just look in the show notes or on our website for all the details. Another factor that can influence the amount of DNA that's transferred to an object is the frequency of hand washing. The more you wash your hands may mean the less DNA you leave for transfer, as do your personal habits. So do you touch your face, your nose, your eyes, your hair or your mouth frequently? And that reference is from a 2002 paper by Wickenheiser. Those actions can lead to more DNA being on your hands and then passed on to the object. The type of surface obviously impacts on it. The rougher the surface, the greater the likelihood it will collect DNA. The grip of a gun, for example, is an ideal source to collect DNA from. And perspiration, that can increase the amount of DNA transferred, both because it can collect cells as it passes through the pores, and because it can also contain epithelial cells and nucleic acids within it. And that references from a 2012 paper by Quinones and Daniel. Anyway, I don't want to go down too deep a rabbit hole. That isn't needed for this purpose. But one final area I wanted to look at was how long touch DNA persists. And one article I found deals with this, and Raymond et al. From 2009. The study found that samples left outside, so samples exposed to the elements, significantly decreased the chance of recovering DNA, with samples left for 2 weeks showing a significant drop in the number of alleles present on the sample. But samples in a controlled environment were still able to be fully retrieved 6 weeks later, and that was the longest period of time that was tested in that particular study. One other interesting point to raise here, just an aside, the study found that it was possible for an individual to contribute their own and another person's DNA to an object that only they held. For example, a piece of fabric that was held by a female volunteer also showed a partial male profile, and a mixed major male profile and a second minor source were discovered on a piece of wood held only by a female. To give an example of how often that happened, of the 40 glass samples that were analysed for full DNA profiles, 3 of them produced mixed profiles, meaning more than one contributor. Now, only one person touched the glass vial, but that person was able to transfer the DNA of another individual onto that glass vial. So, again, what does all this mean? All those objects that I mentioned earlier that had no DNA present, why did they have no DNA present? And remember, we are talking about absolutely nothing showing up, not an amount that can be analysed. No DNA was present at all. So the dresser drawer swabs, the upright cabinet knob swabs, the corner bedroom doorknob swabs, the open kitchen cabinet swabs, the interior utility doorknob swabs, the back doorknob swabs, and the pistol grip swabs. And one possible reason, and in my opinion a fairly strong possibility, is that the items in question were cleaned. The back doorknob, the open kitchen cabinets, now they were, according to Sandra, items that Jim would have touched in the hours leading up to his murder. Of course, we've seen that it is possible that he didn't contribute any DNA on one of those touches, but it's more likely than not that he would have. So for no DNA to be present on those items would mean that either they were very rarely touched, meaning potentially many months between being touched. I suggest that is highly unlikely, particularly for the back doorknob or the kitchen cabinets. Or it could be that they were thoroughly cleaned very close in time to the last touch. Now also remember, if Jim had been working outside in the yard, he may have been perspiring, meaning the potential for touch DNA to be transferred to that back doorknob is likely increased. Now would the intruders have taken the time to do a thorough clean of something like the kitchen cabinets and the back doorknob? I seriously doubt it, especially if they were panicked, and especially if they were prepared to leave a piece of their own clothing behind. Now the amended report contains a lot more information, and I encourage you to have a look at it. The items that had insufficient information for interpretation are just as interesting, and I think will raise even more questions for you about the possibility of the intruder scenario. Also, it's worth highlighting, given that it's been discussed so frequently by Bob and his followers, how it would have been virtually impossible for the murderer to have committed the murder without cutting themselves. The amended report notes that the knife blade was swabbed and forensically tested. A presumptive test for blood was positive, as would be expected, and the DNA results obtained are consistent with a single source DNA profile of a male individual, with Jim being unable to be excluded as the source of the DNA. The knife handle was also swabbed and forensically tested. The DNA results obtained were consistent with a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals. The DNA results were noted as being consistent with a major male contributor and at least 1 minor contributor. Jim was unable to be excluded as the major contributor. Now, Sandra was specifically excluded as the major contributor, but she is not excluded as the minor contributor, as it is noted that no interpretable results were obtained on the minor contributor. So what does that mean? Well, if someone other than Jim cut themselves on the knife blade, they managed to find a way to perfectly and thoroughly clean off all of their DNA whilst leaving Jim's DNA intact on the blade. And it requires them to be thorough enough to ensure that they left no DNA whatsoever on the blade, yet they left DNA results on the handle. Now, would that be something that panicked intruders would be even remotely bothered doing? I highly doubt it. It seems far more likely to me that whoever committed the murder wasn't cut by the knife, and perhaps also didn't bother trying to remove the touch DNA left on the handle. And that would be strange, particularly if one of those panicked intruders even went to the trouble of removing their blouse and grabbing another one, and the extensive cleanup multiple intruders went to whilst in the confines of the tiny closet with Jim. And that leads me to the next point I wanted to discuss. Adam noted on our page the similarity between the towels which were discarded in the jacuzzi and the towels in the laundry, using photos of the different towels as comparison. I'll put up the specific photos on the page on our website for this week's episode, so if you get a chance, jump on and have a look. The towels look very similar. So what does that mean? It may mean nothing, or it may mean that the towels were ordinarily kept in the laundry. And for me, that finding by Adam was quite a big deal. Not a smoking gun, but an important observation that tells us something about the activities inside the home that night. I've always wondered why, if you accept the intruder argument, when they made the decision to clean themselves up and clean the knife, why didn't they use any of the clothes immediately available to them in Jim's closet? There are many clothes within arm's reach, and presumably the intruders would have had no issue with using dress shirts or pants or anything for that matter to help in the cleanup. The intruder argument is often supported by a scenario where, immediately following Jim's murder, the 1 or 2 or 3 people who were in that tiny space with Jim, and I'm not exactly sure how the story has evolved now and how many people it's claimed were inside the closet, but the last story I heard was that one of the intruders who committed the murder would have called out to another intruder to find something to help them clean up. Now, that other intruder would then rush off into another part of the house to find some towels for the intruders in the closet to clean themselves up with. Presumably so those in the closet didn't have to leave the closet for some inexplicable reason. Why they would be worried about moving outside the closet is in itself strange. So, aside from that being unusual, again, why not just grab some of the clothes they were surrounded by and use them to clean themselves, rather than waiting on someone else to go and find something? Or, even more relevantly, why not simply use the towel that was with Jim? It could have been grabbed easily and used to clean themselves immediately if they so wished. Instead, the best argument that can be offered up to try and explain the situation is that one of them went to the laundry to get the towels. Now, at this point, you can probably think about whether those apparent intruders were incredibly panicked, in which case I doubt they would have been composed enough to ask one of the other intruders to find them a towel, especially given there was a towel right beside them that they could have used. Remember, the panicked intruder story has been used as a reason for so many of the valuable items to have been left in the house. The backpack, the laptops, etc. So it's an important aspect of the intruder argument, but I think it completely falls apart when you look at other evidence. So too panicked to remember to take the laptops that you spent at least half an hour interrogating Jim to obtain the password for and packing them up in their laptop bag, yet not panicked enough to knock over large bags of leaves in the walkway exiting the garage whilst supposedly carrying multiple extremely heavy power tools, a TV, guitar, DVD player, Xbox, etc. I think it's reasonably clear that the panicked intruder story is a stretch, but I think once you look at all of the evidence and at the same time try and make all of the individual theories for the intruders being present in the house fit, it moves from being a stretch to being so far beyond reasonable that no one would believe it. Well, except those who are so determined to find a wrongful conviction in this case, regardless of the facts, because, remember, Bob had no plan B, and he was already locked and loaded. We look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice, as we continue to set the record straight.
Thank you.